Today I'm going to show you an alternate method of creating the two-row bind-off. Now, a two-row bind-off is very beautiful. It's a decorative bind-off and makes a tiny row of eyelets along your bound-off edge, which is useful if you're going to be adding fringe, or in my case, if I wanted to match a row of slip stitches along my sides. The size of the eyelets will match the size of my slip stitches, which makes for a beautiful matching shawl. So the problem that I found with the two-row bind-off is that when you bind off, you drop your working yarn over here and then start working back on the other side, and you end up with a loop over here and your working yarn over here, and then you have to get an extra piece of yarn and tie that off and bind off over here and weave in all the ends. I didn't want to do that, and so I'm going to show you an alternate way to do this. It's much simpler. It works only if you have a circular needle, or if you're willing to just transfer all of your stitches back to the other side. But what you're going to do is, instead of knitting all of your stitches and binding them off, you will be knit one, purl one. So we will first knit one, and I'm going to see a problem there, purl one. Then you pull that first knit stitch over your purl stitch. You bind that off. Now we have one stitch on the needle. But instead of knitting and binding off, you're going to knit one, purl one again. And yeah. Knit one, purl one. We have 3 stitches on the needle. You will bind off, picking up that center stitch and binding off. Now we have 2 stitches left on the needle, our 2 purl stitches. We are going to knit one, purl one again. Bind off one stitch. So you can see we're dropping one stitch, binding off one stitch, leaving one stitch on the needle, binding off one stitch, leaving one stitch on the needle. Do that across. And here we are at the last 2 stitches. So we will knit one, purl one, bind one off. I'm having a hard time doing this at that angle. So now you should have something that looks like this. Now, in a traditional two-row bind-off, what you would do now is turn your work, drop your yarn, and start binding off by slipping your first 2 stitches, binding one off over the other, binding one off over the other, until you get down to this end and you'd have a loop. And you'd have a tail. Now, I don't want to do that. What I'm going to do is, instead of turning my work, I'm going to slide it back through to the other end of my needle. Now, if you were working on straight needles, you could just pass all your stitches over to your first needle so that you are on the end that does not have a working yarn. You're going to start over here on the opposite end from where you left your tail, so that when you end up, you will end up at your tail. Okay? So we'll start again, this time without any working yarn. What we're going to do is bind these stitches off. So we will slip the first 2 stitches purlwise. Then simply take your first stitch over your second stitch. Easy enough, and you can see that there's a rather large stitch there. That's going to make our eyelet. So we slip our next stitch. bind off by taking it over, and there's our next stitch bound off. So we'll just continue that across. Slide it over, bind off, slip it over, bind off. And carry that all the way across to the end of our yarn. So now we get to the end of our row. I've bound off my second from last stitch. I have one stitch left on my other needle. So I will slip that stitch, bind off, and I've got my tail right here. So then I can just take that loop through like you would normally. And pull tight and pull my end through. Like so. And I have a nice bound off edge. Now, because this can be a little bit less elastic than traditional edging, you might want to go up a needle size, but as you can see, it leaves a nice row of eyelets and large stitches, and it matches my slip stitches, or it would be perfect for putting some fringe through.